Sarah, your children belong in the warehouse, not the boardroom. My sister Rebecca's voice echoed through the Martinez construction company office as she adjusted her designer blazer. I watched 17-year-old Tyler quietly organizing project files that our foreman desperately needed, while across the hall, Rebecca's son Connor sat in the executive conference room playing games on his phone. Officially titled Management Trainee, despite never having held a hammer in his life. My name is Sarah Martinez, and 6 months after my father Robert's sudden death, I discovered that grief wasn't the only thing tearing our family apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction company's parking lot as I pulled up in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, parking next to Rebecca's brand new BMW that the company had somehow deemed a business necessity. Tyler climbed out of the passenger seat, his work boots already scuffed from helping load materials at 5:30 that morning, while Madison Stone, Rebecca's 16-year-old daughter, wouldn't arrive until noon for her cushy customer relations position that mostly involved posting on the company's social media accounts. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially the veteran crew members who'd worked alongside my father for decades. Inside the office, the familiar smell of coffee and blueprint paper should have been comforting, but instead it reminded me of how everything had changed since Dad's heart attack. Robert Martinez had built this company from nothing, starting as a day laborer who spoke broken English and ending as one of Riverside's most respected contractors. His calloused hands had literally laid the foundation of every project we'd completed, and his word had been worth more than any contract in the industry. Now, 6 months later, those same projects were falling behind schedule and over budget under Rebecca's, quote, modern management approach. Anna Rodriguez, Dad's secretary for 15 years, looked up from her desk with worried eyes as Tyler and I walked past. She'd been trying to hold things together since Rebecca took over, but the strain showed in every line on her face. Sarah, the Westfield project is asking for another meeting, she whispered, glancing toward Rebecca's corner office where my sister was loudly discussing her weekend spa plans with someone on the phone. The client says the timeline doesn't match what your father promised, and they're threatening to pull the contract. My stomach tightened. The Westfield shopping center renovation was our biggest project, worth $2 million, and employing 30 of our crew members. Dad had spent months cultivating that relationship, understanding every detail of what they needed and when they needed it. Rebecca had inherited the account along with everything else, but she treated it like a social networking opportunity rather than the complex construction project it actually was. Tyler set down his backpack and immediately started organizing the scattered invoices on Anna's desk, a habit he'd developed over the past year of working here after school and weekends. At 17, he understood more about construction scheduling than Connor, who was a year older and supposedly being groomed to take over operations someday. Mom, the cement delivery for the Rodriguez House Foundation was supposed to be yesterday, Tyler said quietly, studying the logistics board. If we don't pour by Friday, we'll miss the city inspection window. I felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with sadness watching my son. He'd inherited his grandfather's eye for detail and his genuine care for doing things right. Every project manager respected Tyler's opinion, even though he was technically just a part-time employee. Meanwhile, Connor spent his days in the executive office, drawing the same salary as our senior foreman while contributing nothing but complaints about having to occasionally visit job sites. The office door chimed and Marcus Johnson walked in, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a man trying to manage 3 construction crews with inadequate support. Marcus had been Dad's right-hand man for 20 years, the kind of foreman who could look at a foundation and know if it would last 50 years or 5. He nodded respectfully to me before approaching Anna's desk, his voice low but urgent. We've got problems with the Henderson house, Marcus said, his eyes darting toward Rebecca's office. The electrical subcontractor is saying they never received payment for last month's work, and now they're threatening to walk off the job. The homeowners are asking questions, and I don't have answers. He rubbed his forehead, a gesture I'd seen Dad make countless times when dealing with difficult situations. Your father never would have let payments slip like this. He always said our reputation depended on treating everyone fairly. Before I could respond, Rebecca's office door swung open, and she emerged in a cloud of expensive perfume, her perfectly styled hair and manicured nails making her look more like she was heading to a country club than a construction company. "Marcus, is there a problem?" she asked in the condescending tone she'd adopted since becoming the company's de facto leader. "I thought we discussed keeping workplace drama to a minimum." Marcus straightened, his respect for our family warring with his frustration at the situation. "Ma'am, we need to discuss the payment schedules for our subcontractors. Several of them are reporting delays, and it's affecting our project timelines." His voice remained professional, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Rebecca waved her hand dismissively, the gesture eerily similar to how our mother had always brushed off concerns she didn't want to address. "Those contractors need to be more patient. Cash flow management is complicated, Marcus. You handle the building, I'll handle the business side." She turned toward the door, clearly considering the conversation over. Connor and I, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I have a lunch meeting with the Riverside Chamber of Commerce. It's important for the company's image to maintain those relationships. As she clicked away in her designer heels, Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd seen on Dad's crew members countless times over the years. It was the look of skilled professionals watching their life's work being mismanaged by people who didn't understand what they were dealing with. "Sarah," he said quietly, "your father built this company on trust. These subcontractors have families depending on getting paid on time. If we keep delaying payments while spending money on networking lunches, we're going to lose more than just contracts." Tyler looked up from the invoices he'd been reviewing, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mom, look at this," he said, pointing to a stack of papers. "The material costs for the Westfield project are showing prices that don't match what I remember Dad negotiating. These lumber invoices are 30% higher than what Thompson Lumber quoted us last month." I moved closer to examine the documents Tyler had noticed, feeling that familiar chill that came whenever something didn't add up. Dad had taught me basic bookkeeping when I first started working here 15 years ago, back when Rebecca was still married to her first husband and living in Phoenix. Robert Martinez might not have had a college education, but he had an instinct for numbers that came from years of calculating materials, labor, and profit margins down to the penny. Anna glanced nervously toward Rebecca's office, then leaned closer to us. "Sarah, I've been trying to reconcile the accounts for weeks, but some of the invoices don't match what I remember ordering. Your sister says it's just inflation and supply chain issues, but..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable criticizing her new boss. The front door opened again, and Lily bounced in with the energy of a 15-year-old who just finished her school day. My daughter had inherited her grandfather's infectious optimism along with his work ethic, and she'd been volunteering to help with filing and data entry since she was 13. While Madison Stone treated her part-time position like an extension of her social media presence, Lily genuinely enjoyed learning about different aspects of the business. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Tyler," Lily said, dropping her backpack and immediately noticing the concerned expressions around Anna's desk. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Henderson called the house yesterday asking about when her kitchen renovation would be finished. She sounded worried. Before I could answer, Connor Stone strolled through the office, his expensive sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. At 18, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd been told he was destined for greatness without ever having to prove it. His internship position came with a salary higher than what Anna made after 15 years with the company, and everyone knew he was being positioned to eventually take over operations despite having no practical experience. "Hey, Aunt Sarah," Connor said with the casual familiarity of someone who knew his position was secure regardless of his performance. "Mom wants me to sit in on the Westfield client meeting next week. She says it's important for me to start building relationships with our major accounts." He grabbed a bottle of water from the office refrigerator, completely ignoring the fact that Tyler was carefully organizing project documents that Connor should have been handling as part of his management training. I watched my nephew for a moment, remembering how different things had been when Dad was alive. Robert Martinez had never believed in giving anyone responsibilities they hadn't earned, regardless of family relationships. He'd made me start in the filing room and work my way up to office manager over several years, learning every aspect of the business along the way. Tyler and Lily had been earning their positions through genuine contribution and demonstrated competence. not through family connections and networking lunches. The afternoon wore on with a series of small frustrations that seemed to accumulate like storm clouds. A supplier called to complain about a delayed payment that was now affecting their ability to deliver materials for the Rodriguez Foundation project. One of our longtime clients stopped by to express concern about changes to their original timeline, changes that Rebecca had made without consulting the project managers who actually understood the technical requirements. Through it all, Tyler continued working methodically through the paperwork that kept our projects moving forward, while Connor spent most of his time on personal phone calls and social media. By 5 o'clock, when the office officially closed, I found myself staying late once again to catch up on the administrative work that had been piling up. Rebecca had left at 3:30 for her Chamber of Commerce meeting, taking Connor with her for what she called executive development. Anna had gone home to her own family, leaving me alone with the growing stack of invoices, contract modifications, and client communications that needed attention. Tyler appeared in the doorway of my small office, his face showing the same determination I'd seen in Dad countless times over the years. "Mom, I've been thinking about those invoices I noticed earlier. Would it help if I compared them to the original quotes Dad kept in his project files?" I remember him saying that documentation was the key to avoiding disputes. My son's suggestion reminded me of one of Dad's fundamental principles about running an honest business. Robert Martinez had kept meticulous records, not just for legal protection, but because he believed that transparency built trust with clients and subcontractors alike. If there were discrepancies in our current invoicing, those original files would provide the evidence we needed to understand what was happening. As Tyler headed to the filing room to retrieve Dad's project documentation, I found myself thinking about the phone call I'd received from Mom that morning. Margaret Martinez had asked me to come by the house this weekend to help clean out Dad's home office, a task she'd been putting off since his death 6 months ago. She said it was time to pack up his personal papers and business documents, to finally accept that he was gone and move forward with our lives. The request had seemed reasonable at the time, just another part of the grieving process that we all had to work through together. But sitting in the office that evening, surrounded by evidence of financial irregularities and mismanagement, I began to wonder if there might be more to Dad's personal files than just sentimental mementos. Robert Martinez had been the kind of man who planned for every contingency, who understood that protecting his family and his business required more than just good intentions. Tyler returned with a box of project folders, his expression troubled as he set them on my desk. "Mom, I found something interesting," he said, opening one of the files to reveal Dad's original contract negotiations for the Westfield project. "Look at these material cost estimates compared to what we're actually paying now. It's not just inflation causing the increases." As I examined the documents Tyler had discovered, I realized that tomorrow's visit to clean out Dad's office might reveal more than just memories. If my father had suspected that something was wrong with the company's finances, if he'd been concerned about protecting the business he'd spent 25 years building, he would have kept records. He would have prepared for exactly the kind of situation we now found ourselves facing. The thought of what we might find in Dad's home office both excited and terrified me. Robert Martinez had always been a step ahead of problems, anticipating challenges and preparing solutions before they became crises. If he'd left behind evidence of what was really happening to our family's company, it could change everything. But it could also mean that the situation was far worse than any of us had imagined. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that always reminded me of Dad's favorite season for construction work. The cool weather meant crews could work longer hours without the exhaustion that came with summer heat, and Robert Martinez had always scheduled his most challenging projects for these months. As I drove toward my childhood home in my Honda Civic, I couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend would mark another turning point in our family's story, though I had no idea how dramatically things were about to change. Mom had been living alone in the sprawling ranch house since Dad's death, and the isolation was beginning to show. Margaret Martinez had always been the social one in their partnership, organizing neighborhood barbecues and managing the family's community relationships, while Dad focused on building the business. Without Robert's steady presence, she seemed to drift through the house like a ghost, avoiding the home office where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing contracts and planning future projects. Tyler and Lily had volunteered to help with the cleaning, understanding instinctively that this task represented more than just organizing paperwork. Dad's office had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd transformed from the jovial family man who coached Little League and attended school plays into the focused businessman who'd built Martinez Construction from a one-man operation into a company employing 50 people. Every decision that shaped our lives had been made in that room, surrounded by industry magazines, project photographs, and the awards he'd received from the Riverside Contractors Association. Walking through the front door, I was struck by how quiet the house felt without Dad's presence. He'd always been an early riser, usually up by 5:30 to review the day's schedules and make calls to suppliers before the office opened. The coffee maker would be gurgling by 6, and the sound of his boots on the kitchen tile would signal the start of another day devoted to building something lasting and meaningful. Now the house felt suspended in time, as if Mom had been afraid to disturb any routine that might erase her memories of their life together. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, her silver hair neatly styled, but her eyes showing the weariness that had become her constant companion since the funeral. At 67, she'd always been the kind of woman who took pride in maintaining appearances, but grief had softened her edges in ways that made her seem both more fragile and more authentic than before. She hugged each of us carefully, as if physical contact might overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "I know this needs to be done," she said, leading us toward Dad's office with the reluctant steps of someone approaching a difficult medical procedure. "Rebecca keeps saying that holding on to his papers won't bring him back, and she's probably right. But every time I walk past that room, I can almost hear him talking on the phone with Marcus, or explaining some technical problem to one of the subcontractors." The office door had remained closed since Dad's death, and opening it felt like breaking a seal on a time capsule. Everything remained exactly as Robert Martinez had left it on the morning of his fatal heart attack. His coffee cup still sat on the desk beside a half-finished crossword puzzle, and his reading glasses lay folded next to a stack of industry journals he'd been reviewing. The familiar smell of Old Spice and paper lingered in the air, creating an almost overwhelming sense of his continued presence. Tyler moved carefully around the room, his respect for his grandfather's memory evident in every gesture. At 17, he'd developed the same methodical approach to organization that had made Dad such an effective project manager, and he began sorting documents with the kind of systematic attention that most adults never mastered. Lily started with the bookshelf, carefully removing Dad's collection of construction manuals and industry references, each volume marked with bookmarks and handwritten notes that revealed his commitment to continuous learning. As I began emptying Dad's desk drawers, I discovered the extent to which he'd maintained parallel records for every aspect of the business. In addition to the official files kept at the company office, Robert had maintained personal copies of every major contract, every subcontractor agreement, and every financial transaction that affected Martinez Construction. The level of detail was extraordinary, suggesting not just professional thoroughness but something approaching obsession with documentation and verification. "Mom, look at this," Lily said, holding up a leather-bound journal filled with Dad's distinctive handwriting. Grandpa was keeping some kind of daily log about the business. These entries go back years, and some of them mention things that don't sound like normal construction notes. I took the journal from Lily's hands, immediately recognizing Dad's habit of recording not just facts but his impressions and concerns about various situations. The entries revealed a side of Robert Martinez that he'd kept hidden from the family, a man who'd been growing increasingly worried about changes in the business environment and the challenges facing small contractors in an industry dominated by larger corporations with deeper resources and political connections. One entry from 8 months before his death caught my attention. Rebecca's suggestions about expanding into commercial development sound impressive, but something feels wrong about the financing she's proposing. The terms don't match what I've seen from legitimate lenders, and she gets defensive when I ask for detailed explanations. Need to research these companies before making any commitments that could put the business at risk. Tyler looked up from the filing cabinet he'd been organizing, his expression thoughtful as he processed what we were discovering. Grandpa was more worried about things than he let on, wasn't he? Some of these documents make it sound like he was preparing for problems that he hoped wouldn't happen but wanted to be ready for anyway. The observation was remarkably perceptive for someone Tyler's age. but it reflected the maturity that came from working alongside experienced professionals who took their responsibilities seriously. Dad had always treated Tyler like an adult when discussing business matters, explaining the reasoning behind various decisions and helping him understand the long-term consequences of short-term choices. That education was now proving invaluable as we tried to piece together the full picture of what had been happening at Martinez Construction. As the morning progressed, we uncovered layer after layer of Dad's concerns about the company's direction and the people he'd been trusting with its future. A folder marked Personnel Issues contained documentation of several incidents where Rebecca had overruled project managers without consulting Dad, leading to cost overruns and client complaints. Another file revealed his attempts to verify the credentials of several subcontractors that Rebecca had recommended, attempts that had revealed discrepancies in their licensing and insurance coverage. "Your father was always careful about protecting the business," Mom said, settling into his desk chair with the careful movements of someone still adjusting to widowhood. "After your grandfather lost his farm during the Depression, Robert swore that he'd never put his family at risk by being careless with money or trusting the wrong people. I think he was starting to worry that Rebecca's approach to business was too focused on quick growth and not enough on building solid foundations." The comment revealed something I'd suspected, but never been able to confirm during Dad's lifetime. Robert Martinez had been concerned about Rebecca's influence on the company, but he'd been trying to address those concerns diplomatically rather than create family conflict. His sudden death had prevented him from implementing whatever protective measures he'd been planning, leaving the rest of us to discover his worries through the documentation he'd left behind. Tyler had moved to the tall filing cabinet in the corner of the room, methodically working through folders that contained copies of every major business decision made over the past 5 years. His systematic approach was uncovering patterns that none of us had noticed while dealing with the day-to-day demands of running a construction company. "Mom, I'm seeing a lot of invoices here that don't match what we have in the main office files. It looks like Grandpa was keeping track of discrepancies between what Rebecca was reporting and what was actually happening with various projects." The discovery sent a chill through me as I realized the implications of what Tyler was describing. If Dad had been documenting evidence of financial irregularities, it meant his concerns had gone beyond general worries about business philosophy to specific suspicions about fraudulent activity. The careful man who'd built Martinez Construction through honest dealing and meticulous attention to detail had been preparing to confront problems that could destroy everything he'd worked to create. Lily found another journal, this one focused specifically on the 6 months before Dad's death. The entries revealed his growing frustration with Rebecca's management style and his increasing suspicion that money was being diverted from legitimate business expenses to personal uses that benefited her family while putting the company's financial stability at risk. "Connor's internship salary is 3 times what we pay experienced crew members," one entry noted. "Madison's social media position serves no real business purpose, and the car allowances Rebecca approved for both kids represent a significant drain on cash flow." As we continued working through Dad's papers, I began to understand the scope of his investigation into the company's finances. Robert Martinez had been conducting his own forensic audit, comparing official records with independent verification from suppliers and subcontractors. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling, revealing systematic inflation of expenses, diversion of payments to accounts controlled by Rebecca, and approval of expenditures that served no legitimate business purpose. "He was building a case," I said aloud, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Dad knew something was wrong, and he was gathering evidence to prove it. "These aren't just business records, they're documentation of fraud." Tyler nodded grimly, holding up a folder containing correspondence between Dad and the company's accountant. "Look at these emails from Linda Chen. She was asking Grandpa about irregularities in the books, and he was asking her to verify specific transactions without letting Rebecca know about the investigation. They were working together to figure out exactly how much money was being stolen." The enormity of what we were discovering began to sink in, as we realized that Dad's death had interrupted a comprehensive investigation into embezzlement that could have saved Martinez Construction from the financial problems we were now experiencing. Robert Martinez had been preparing to confront Rebecca with evidence of her theft, evidence that could have resulted in criminal charges and immediate termination of her access to company funds. Mom sat quietly at Dad's desk, tears streaming down her face as she processed the revelation that her husband had died while trying to protect their family's legacy from destruction by their own daughter. "He never said anything to me about this," she whispered. "Robert was always so careful not to worry me with business problems. But this was more than just business. This was family." Lily moved to comfort her grandmother, displaying the same gentle strength that had made her such a valuable addition to the office staff despite her age. "Grandpa was trying to handle it the right way, Grandma. He was gathering proof before making accusations, because he knew how serious this was. He didn't want to tear the family apart unless he was absolutely certain about what was happening." As afternoon turned to evening, we had filled several boxes with Dad's documentation of financial irregularities and potential fraud. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, revealing not just isolated incidents of poor judgment, but a systematic pattern of theft that had been draining Martinez. Construction of the resources needed to remain competitive in an increasingly challenging market. Tyler had created a timeline of suspicious transactions, correlating them with Rebecca's various personal expenditures and the financial problems that had been affecting our ability to pay subcontractors and suppliers on schedule. The pattern was unmistakable. Money had been diverted from legitimate business expenses to support a lifestyle that Rebecca's actual salary could never have sustained. "The question now is what we do with all of this," I said, looking at the boxes of evidence that Dad had spent months accumulating. "Rebecca has been running the company for 6 months, and she's convinced Mom that she's the only one qualified to manage the business side of operations. Presenting this evidence is going to destroy any possibility of family reconciliation." Mom wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, suddenly looking more like the strong woman who'd supported Dad through 25 years of building a business from nothing. "Sarah, your father spent his life working to build something that would take care of our family for generations. If Rebecca has been stealing from that legacy, then stopping her isn't about destroying family relationships. It's about protecting what Robert died trying to preserve." The decision felt monumental, but I knew Mom was right. Dad had been preparing to confront this problem when his heart attack prevented him from taking action. Now it fell to us to complete the work he'd started, to use the evidence he'd gathered to protect Martinez Construction from further damage. As we prepared to leave that evening, Tyler made one final discovery that changed everything. While organizing the last drawer of Dad's filing cabinet, he found a key taped to the bottom of the drawer, accompanied by a note in Dad's handwriting. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me before I could address the problems at the company. This key opens the safe behind my desk. Inside you'll find everything you need to protect our family's future. Trust your instincts. And remember that I always believed you understood the real value of what we built together." The three of us stared at the key, realizing that Dad's preparation had gone even further than we'd imagined. Somewhere behind his desk was a safe that none of us had known existed, containing additional evidence or documentation that he'd considered too sensitive to keep in the regular filing system. The discovery promised answers to questions we'd been afraid to ask, but it also meant that the full scope of the crisis facing Martinez Construction was probably worse than anything we'd uncovered so far. Mom stood slowly, her movements showing the weariness of someone who'd been forced to confront truths she'd spent months avoiding. "We need to open that safe," she said with quiet determination. "Whatever your father left for us, we owe it to him and to the company to see this through to the end." Tyler began examining the wall behind Dad's desk, running his hands along the wood paneling in search of any irregularities that might indicate a hidden compartment. His persistence paid off when he discovered a section of paneling that moved slightly when pressed, revealing the outline of a concealed safe that had been expertly installed behind the decorative woodwork. The safe was larger than I'd expected, clearly designed to hold substantial documentation rather than just valuables or cash. Dad's note had suggested that whatever he'd placed inside represented the key to protecting our family's future, but the weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming as Tyler inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet house, and as I pulled the heavy door open, I realized that everything we thought we knew about our family's situation was about to change forever. The safe contained not just additional evidence of Rebecca's fraud, but documents that revealed the full extent of Dad's planning to protect Martinez Construction and ensure that his life's work would survive whatever challenges lay ahead. Inside, we found copies of legal documents that Dad had been preparing with his attorney, James Hartwell, including a detailed forensic accounting report that documented every fraudulent transaction Rebecca had authorized over the past 18 months. The report estimated that she had stolen over $300,000 from company accounts, money that had been diverted to personal expenses, luxury purchases for her children, and investments in business ventures that had no connection to Martinez Construction. But the most shocking discovery was a revised will that Dad had been preparing to sign, a document that would have changed the ownership structure of Martinez Construction to reflect his true assessment of who deserved to inherit control of the company. According to the new will, Rebecca would have been removed entirely from any management role, while I would have gained majority ownership with Tyler and Lily inheriting shares that reflected their demonstrated commitment to the business. He was going to disinherit Rebecca, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper as she read through the legal documents. Robert was so angry about what she was doing that he was prepared to cut her out of the family business entirely. The revelation was staggering, but it also explained why Dad had been so methodical about documenting every aspect of Rebecca's fraudulent activity. He hadn't just been building a case for criminal prosecution, he'd been preparing to justify a decision that would fundamentally alter our family's future by ensuring that Martinez Construction passed to the people who'd proven their dedication to preserving his legacy. Tyler found one final document that brought tears to my eyes as I read Dad's handwritten letter explaining his reasoning for the changes he'd been planning to make. Sarah has spent 15 years learning every aspect of this business, and her children have shown the same commitment to honest work that built everything we have today. Rebecca sees the company as a source of easy money rather than a responsibility to our employees and our community. I cannot allow her to destroy what took me 25 years to build. As we sat in Dad's office surrounded by the evidence of his final efforts to protect our family's legacy, I realized that his death had prevented him from implementing the changes that could have saved Martinez Construction from months of mismanagement and theft. But his preparation had given us everything we needed to complete the work he'd started, to use the legal system and the evidence he'd gathered to restore the company to the values and practices that had made it successful. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but as I looked at Tyler and Lily, I saw the same determination that had driven Dad to build something lasting from nothing but hard work and integrity. We had the tools we needed to fight for our family's future, and we had the evidence to prove that our cause was just. Everything Dad had worked for hung in the balance, but his careful planning had given us a chance to save it. Now we just had to find the courage to use what he'd left us. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Linda Chen, Martinez Construction's head accountant, and her voice carried the tension of someone who'd been losing sleep over numbers that refused to balance correctly. I'd known Linda for 8 years, ever since Dad hired her to modernize our financial systems, and she'd never called me directly at home unless there was a genuine crisis requiring immediate attention. Her careful, methodical approach to accounting had always complemented Dad's instinctive understanding of construction economics, creating a partnership that had kept our finances stable through multiple economic downturns. Sarah, I need to speak with you privately about some discrepancies I've discovered in our quarterly reports, Linda said, her usual professional composure strained by whatever she'd uncovered. These aren't the kind of irregularities that can be explained by clerical errors or timing differences. We're looking at systematic manipulation of our accounting records, and I'm legally obligated to report my findings to the appropriate authorities unless there's a reasonable explanation. The timing of Linda's call, coming just 2 days after our discovery of Dad's hidden safe and its devastating contents, felt like more than mere coincidence. I suspected that Linda's investigation had been running parallel to Dad's own efforts to document Rebecca's fraudulent activities, and that she'd been waiting for the right moment to present her findings to someone who could take appropriate action without creating unnecessary complications for the company's ongoing operations. I arranged to meet Linda at her office early Tuesday morning, before Rebecca typically arrived for her abbreviated workdays, that seemed to focus more on networking activities than actual business management. Tyler asked to join us, his involvement in organizing Dad's documentation having given him insights into the company's financial operations that many adults would struggle to understand. Linda agreed immediately, recognizing that Tyler's systematic approach to data analysis could be valuable in explaining complex accounting irregularities to someone without formal financial training. Linda's office occupied a corner of the Martinez construction building, its walls lined with filing cabinets containing 8 years of meticulously organized financial records. She'd always insisted on maintaining both digital and physical copies of every transaction, a redundancy that Dad had appreciated even when it seemed excessive to younger employees who preferred purely electronic systems. That thoroughness was now proving invaluable, as Linda spread out printouts and documents that revealed the scope of financial manipulation she'd discovered. "Your father contacted me 3 months before his death with concerns about expense reports that didn't match his project records," Linda began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the evidence she'd prepared. "He asked me to conduct what he called a quiet audit of all transactions involving discretionary spending and vendor payments. What I found was far worse than either of us had anticipated." The documentation Linda presented was overwhelming in its complexity and thoroughness. She'd identified dozens of fraudulent transactions dating back nearly 2 years, each one carefully disguised as legitimate business expenses, but actually representing diversions of company funds to accounts controlled by Rebecca, or expenditures that served no genuine business purpose. The pattern showed increasing boldness over time, as if Rebecca had grown confident that her activities would never be discovered or challenged. Tyler studied the financial records with the same focused attention he'd brought to construction project logistics, asking questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of how business accounting should function versus what these records actually showed. "Mrs. Chen, these supply invoices show payments to companies that I've never heard Dad or Marcus mention in project meetings. Are these legitimate vendors, or are they somehow connected to Aunt Rebecca?" Linda's expression grew even more serious as she pulled out another folder containing her research into the companies that had received substantial payments from Martinez Construction over the past 18 months. "Tyler, that's exactly the right question to ask. Several of these vendors don't appear to exist as legitimate businesses. Their addresses correspond to post office boxes, their phone numbers go to answering services, and their business licenses were issued just weeks before they began receiving payments from our company." The revelation that Rebecca had been creating fictitious companies to facilitate her theft added a new dimension to the crisis facing Martinez Construction. This wasn't just embezzlement or misuse of company funds. It was a sophisticated fraud scheme that could result in serious criminal charges and potentially destroy the company's reputation with clients and suppliers who depended on our integrity and reliability. "There's more," Linda continued, opening a thick folder that contained correspondence between herself and various banks, suppliers, and government agencies. "I've been trying to verify the legitimacy of these transactions through official channels, and what I've discovered suggests that your father's suspicions were completely justified. Rebecca has been systematically stealing from the company while creating documentation that makes her theft appear to be legitimate business expenses." As Linda walked us through the evidence she'd compiled, I began to understand why Dad had been so methodical about building his own case against Rebecca. The financial manipulation was extensive enough to threaten the company's survival, but it was also sophisticated enough to require expert analysis and legal intervention to address properly. Simply confronting Rebecca with accusations wouldn't be sufficient. We needed the kind of comprehensive evidence that could withstand scrutiny from law enforcement and the court system. Tyler had been taking notes throughout Linda's presentation, and his summary of the situation demonstrated a maturity that made me proud while simultaneously breaking my heart. At 17, he should have been focused on college applications and teenage concerns, not learning about corporate fraud and family betrayal. "So Aunt Rebecca has been stealing money for almost 2 years. She's created fake companies to hide the theft, and she's done it so carefully that it looked legitimate until someone really examined the records closely." Linda nodded approvingly at Tyler's analysis. "That's exactly right, and it explains why your grandfather was so concerned about documenting everything he discovered. This type of fraud requires careful investigation and legal expertise to prosecute successfully. Your father was building a case that could result in criminal charges and civil recovery of the stolen funds. The mention of criminal prosecution brought home the reality of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a family disagreement about business management or a misunderstanding about expense policies. Rebecca had committed serious crimes that could result in imprisonment and would certainly result in her permanent removal from any role in Martinez construction. The decision to pursue legal action would irrevocably destroy our family relationships, but the alternative was allowing her to continue stealing until the company collapsed entirely. Linda pulled out one final document that changed my understanding of the timeline we were working with. Sarah, I need you to understand that this situation is becoming urgent. I've been delaying the submission of our quarterly tax reports because the numbers don't reconcile with our actual financial position. If I file reports that include these fraudulent transactions, I could be held personally liable for knowingly submitting false information to the government. I can't protect the company by continuing to delay much longer. The pressure of Linda's deadline added urgency to decisions I'd been hoping to make carefully and deliberately. We had less than 2 weeks to either confront Rebecca with evidence of her fraud or report the situation to authorities who would begin their own investigation, regardless of our family's preferences. Either way, the comfortable fiction that Rebecca was simply an ineffective manager rather than a criminal was about to end permanently. I spent the rest of Tuesday morning calling James Hartwell, Dad's longtime attorney, to schedule an emergency meeting that would determine our legal options and responsibilities. James had known our family for 15 years, having handled everything from contract disputes to Dad's estate planning, and his familiarity with both our personal dynamics and our business operations would be crucial in navigating the complex legal and ethical issues we now faced. James agreed to meet with us that afternoon, and his grave expression when we arrived at his office confirmed that he'd been expecting this conversation ever since Dad's death had prevented the implementation of the legal changes they'd been planning together. His office walls were lined with photographs documenting decades of legal practice in Riverside, including several pictures of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and groundbreaking events where he'd worked alongside Dad to establish Martinez Construction's reputation in the community. Your father came to me 4 months before his death with concerns about financial irregularities at the company, James began, settling behind his desk with the weary expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary information. We spent considerable time developing a legal strategy that would protect the business and your family while addressing the criminal activity he'd discovered. His sudden death prevented us from implementing those plans, but the legal framework we developed is still valid and could be activated immediately. Tyler and I listened intently as James explained the comprehensive legal strategy that Dad had been preparing to deploy against Rebecca's fraudulent activities. The plan included criminal referrals to law enforcement, civil litigation to recover stolen funds, immediate removal of Rebecca from all management positions, and restructuring of the company's ownership to reflect Dad's true intentions for succession planning. The evidence your father compiled, combined with Linda Chen's independent verification and the additional documentation you discovered in his safe, provides more than sufficient grounds for criminal prosecution, James continued. However, you need to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. Rebecca will face serious criminal charges, and your family relationships will be permanently altered. The weight of that decision felt overwhelming, but James helped us understand that we weren't really choosing whether to pursue legal action. Linda's professional obligations and the company's legal responsibilities meant that the fraud would be reported to authorities regardless of our personal preferences. Our choice was whether to take control of the process by working with law enforcement proactively or to wait for them to discover the situation through their own investigation. There's one more factor you need to consider, James said, pulling out a folder containing the revised will and ownership documents that Dad had been preparing to sign. Your father's original estate planning gave Rebecca significant ownership interests in Martinez Construction, but his revised documents would have transferred those interests to you and your children. The revised will was never signed, but the evidence of fraud provides legal grounds for challenging Rebecca's inherited ownership rights. The revelation that we could potentially recover not just stolen money but also Rebecca's ownership stake in the company added another dimension to our legal options. If successful, the litigation could result in my gaining majority control of Martinez Construction while permanently removing Rebecca from any role in the business she'd been systematically looting for personal gain. Tyler asked the question that had been troubling me since our meeting with Linda Chen. Mr. Hartwell, if we go forward with criminal charges against Aunt Rebecca, what happens to Connor and Madison? They've been benefiting from the stolen money, but they probably didn't know it was illegal. James's expression softened as he addressed Tyler's concern about his cousins, recognizing the maturity and compassion that the question demonstrated. That's a thoughtful question, Tyler, and it shows the kind of character your grandfather tried to instill in all of his grandchildren. From a legal standpoint, Connor and Madison would be considered innocent beneficiaries unless there's evidence that they knowingly participated in the fraud. However, any luxury items or benefits they received from stolen money could potentially be subject to recovery as part of civil litigation. The explanation helped clarify that pursuing justice against Rebecca didn't necessarily mean destroying her children's futures, but it did mean that they would lose the unearned advantages they'd enjoyed at the expense of Martinez Construction's legitimate operations. Connor's executive salary and Madison's cushy job would end immediately, and they would need to find their own ways forward without the financial support that had been subsidized by their mother's criminal activity. As our meeting with James concluded, he presented us with a timeline for legal action that would need to begin within days if we wanted to maintain control over the process. The first step would be filing a formal complaint with local law enforcement, followed immediately by civil litigation, to recover stolen funds and restructure the company's ownership. The process would be lengthy and emotionally difficult, but it offered the best chance of saving Martinez Construction while ensuring that Dad's true wishes for the company's future were respected. I left James's office with a folder containing the legal documents we would need to sign if we decided to move forward with prosecution, but I also carried the emotional burden of knowing that our decision would determine not just the fate of our family business, but the future relationships among people I'd loved my entire life. The drive home gave me time to think about Dad's example and the values he'd tried to teach us about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Tyler and Lily, explaining the legal options James had outlined and the timeline we were facing for making decisions that couldn't be undone. Both of my children listened with the serious attention of young people who understood that their family's future hung in the balance, and their questions demonstrated wisdom beyond their years. "Mom, what would Grandpa want us to do?" Lily asked, her voice reflecting the pain of someone forced to choose between family loyalty and moral obligation. He spent his whole life building the company, and he was trying to protect it when he died. Would he want us to let Aunt Rebecca keep stealing, or would he want us to stop her, even if it hurts the family? The question cut to the heart of everything we were struggling with, and the answer came from my memories of Dad's character and the values he'd demonstrated throughout his life. Robert Martinez had always believed that protecting something worthwhile required courage and sacrifice, and he'd never chosen the easy path when he could choose the right path instead. Tyler had been reviewing the financial projections that Linda Chen had prepared, showing how the company's future would be affected by different decisions we might make. "Mom, if we don't stop Aunt Rebecca, the company will probably go bankrupt within 2 years. She's stealing too much money, and she's making too many bad decisions. Grandpa built this company to take care of our family for generations, but it won't exist to take care of anyone if we don't do something now." The practical analysis confirmed what my heart had already known. Protecting Rebecca from the consequences of her crimes wouldn't preserve family relationships. It would only delay the inevitable collapse of everything Dad had worked to build. The choice wasn't between family harmony and legal action. It was between enabling continued destruction or fighting to save what could still be preserved. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected confrontation that forced our hand sooner than we'd planned. Rebecca arrived at the office early, clearly agitated about something, and she immediately demanded a meeting with Linda Chen about accounting irregularities that needed to be explained immediately. Her aggressive tone and defensive posture suggested that she'd somehow learned about Linda's investigation, possibly through Connor or Madison, who might have overheard conversations they weren't supposed to hear. I arrived at the office to find Rebecca standing in Linda's doorway, her voice raised in the kind of aggressive confrontation that Dad had never tolerated in professional settings. "I don't appreciate being second-guessed by support staff," Rebecca was saying, her designer clothing and perfect makeup contrasting sharply with Linda's simple professionalism. My business decisions are based on strategic considerations that you wouldn't understand, and I won't have my authority undermined by accountants who don't see the bigger picture. Linda remained calm under Rebecca's verbal assault, but I could see the strain in her posture as she tried to maintain professional boundaries while being attacked for doing her job with integrity and competence. Ms. Martinez-Stone, I'm simply asking for documentation to support expense reports that don't match our vendor records. This is standard accounting practice, and your father always provided complete documentation for any questioned transactions. The mention of Dad seemed to inflame Rebecca's anger, rather than remind her of the professional standards he'd established for company operations. My father is dead, she snapped, her voice carrying through the office and causing several employees to look up from their work with expressions of shock and discomfort. I'm running this company now, and I don't have time to justify every business decision to people who've never been responsible for strategic planning. Tyler appeared at my side, having arrived early to help with project scheduling before school, and his expression showed the same protective instincts that had driven Dad to defend his employees from unreasonable treatment. At 17, Tyler understood that Linda's professional integrity was being attacked for reasons that had nothing to do with accounting competence and everything to do with Rebecca's fear of being exposed. Aunt Rebecca, Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful tone Dad had taught him to use with all adults, but also the firmness of someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Mrs. Chen is just doing her job the same way Grandpa taught her. If there are questions about documentation, wouldn't it be easier to just provide the information she needs rather than arguing about it? Rebecca turned toward Tyler with the kind of condescending expression she'd perfected for dismissing the opinions of people she considered beneath her notice. Tyler, this is adult business that you couldn't possibly understand. Why don't you go organize some files or whatever it is you do around here, and let the grown-ups handle real management decisions? The dismissive treatment of Tyler, combined with her attack on Linda Chen, crystallized everything that was wrong with Rebecca's approach to business leadership. She had no respect for competence or experience, no understanding of the collaborative relationships that made Martinez Construction successful, and no appreciation for the values that Dad had spent 25 years building into the company's culture. I stepped forward, placing myself between Rebecca and Linda Chen, and spoke in the clear, firm voice that I'd learned from watching Dad handle difficult situations throughout my childhood. Rebecca, we need to talk privately about these accounting questions. Linda is following proper procedures, and attacking her professionalism isn't going to resolve whatever concerns you have about documentation requirements. Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she realized that I wasn't going to support her intimidation tactics or allow her to bully employees who were simply doing their jobs with integrity. Sarah, I don't need permission from the office manager to run this company. Daddy left me in charge, and I won't be second-guessed by people who don't understand the complexities of modern business management. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything that could be resolved through family diplomacy or workplace mediation. Rebecca's aggressive defensiveness and her attack on Linda's professionalism made it clear that she had no intention of providing honest answers to legitimate accounting questions. More importantly, her treatment of Tyler and Linda revealed the contempt she felt for anyone who challenged her authority or questioned her decisions. I made the decision that Dad's careful planning had been preparing me to make for months. Rebecca, I think we need to schedule a meeting with James Hartwell to discuss some concerns that have been raised about company finances. There are questions that need to be answered, and having legal counsel present might help us resolve them properly. The mention of legal involvement drained the color from Rebecca's face, and her aggressive posture collapsed into something approaching panic. She knew that James Hartwell had been Dad's attorney and trusted advisor, and she understood that involving him in financial discussions meant that serious questions were being raised about her management of company resources. What kind of concerns? Rebecca asked, her voice losing the confident tone she'd used to attack Linda Chen and dismiss Tyler's reasonable questions. There's nothing wrong with our finances that can't be explained by normal business fluctuations and the challenges of operating in a competitive market. The transformation in Rebecca's demeanor confirmed what we'd suspected about her awareness of the fraudulent activities she'd been conducting. Her shift from aggressive defensiveness to nervous questioning revealed that she knew exactly what kinds of concerns might be raised by a competent attorney reviewing Martinez Construction's financial records. Tyler and I exchanged glances, both of us recognizing that the careful timeline James Hartwell had established for legal action had just been accelerated by Rebecca's own behavior. Her attack on Linda Chen and her obvious fear of legal scrutiny had created a situation where we could no longer delay taking action to protect the company and its employees from further damage. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than we'd planned, but Rebecca's conduct had made it clear that waiting longer would only give her more opportunities to steal money and attack the people who were trying to protect Martinez Construction's integrity. Dad's careful preparation had given us everything we needed to take action, and Rebecca's own behavior had just provided the final justification for using what he'd left us. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and the atmosphere in Martinez Construction's conference room felt charged with the tension of impending revelation. James Hartwell had spent the previous evening preparing a comprehensive presentation of evidence that would expose the full scope of Rebecca's fraudulent activities, while Linda Chen had organized financial documents that told an undeniable story of systematic theft and deception. I sat quietly with Tyler and Lily, surrounded by boxes of documentation that Dad had spent months collecting, knowing that everything we were about to present would change our family forever. The board of directors consisted of 5 members, including Mom as majority shareholder, 2 longtime business associates of Dad's who'd invested in the company during its expansion phase, and surprisingly, Rebecca herself as an inherited board member through Dad's original estate planning. The irony of having Rebecca participate in a meeting that would expose her own criminal activity wasn't lost on anyone, but James had explained that proper legal procedure required following the company's established governance protocols, even when addressing internal fraud. Marcus Johnson arrived early, his weathered face showing the strain of managing construction projects without adequate administrative support, while dealing with increasingly frustrated subcontractors and suppliers. He'd been Dad's most trusted foreman for 20 years, and his presence at the board meeting reflected both his intimate knowledge of company operations and his personal investment in seeing Martinez Construction survive the crisis that Rebecca's mismanagement had created. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly as he took his seat at the conference table, "whatever you're planning to present today, I hope it explains why we've been losing experienced crew members and why suppliers are starting to demand payment in advance. The reputation your father spent 25 years building is being damaged by problems that seem to be getting worse instead of better." The observation reinforced everything we'd discovered about the real-world impact of Rebecca's theft on Martinez Construction's operations. While she'd been diverting company funds to support her family's luxurious lifestyle, the money needed for payroll, supplier payments, and equipment maintenance had been steadily disappearing. The result was a company that appeared successful on paper, but was actually approaching financial collapse due to cash flow problems that Rebecca's fraudulent activities had created. Rebecca arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, accompanied by Connor, who'd apparently been invited to observe the meeting as part of his supposed executive training. Her designer suit and expensive jewelry created a stark contrast with the worn work clothes and practical attire of the other attendees, visually reinforcing the disconnect between her lifestyle and the financial realities facing the company she claimed to be managing effectively. "I'm not sure why this emergency meeting was necessary," Rebecca announced as she settled into her chair, her voice carrying the confident tone of someone who believed her position was secure despite the mounting evidence against her. "Our third quarter numbers show steady revenue, and I've been implementing several strategic initiatives that should improve our competitive position in the regional market." James Hartwell responded by distributing copies of the forensic accounting report that Linda Chen had prepared, along with supporting documentation that included bank records, vendor invoices, and correspondence that revealed the true nature of Rebecca's strategic initiatives. The comprehensive nature of the evidence presentation immediately changed the atmosphere in the room from routine business discussion to serious. "Mrs. Martinez Stone," James began in the formal tone he used for legal proceedings, "we've called this meeting to address substantial evidence of financial fraud that has been discovered through independent investigation of company records. The documentation we're presenting today reveals systematic embezzlement, creation of fictitious vendors, and diversion of company funds for personal use over a period of approximately 18 months. The color drained from Rebecca's face as she realized the scope of the evidence that had been compiled against her, and her confident demeanor collapsed into something approaching panic. Connor looked confused and frightened as he began to understand that his mother's business activities hadn't been the legitimate management decisions she'd claimed they were, but rather criminal acts that could result in serious legal consequences for their entire family. Linda Chen presented the financial analysis with the same methodical precision she brought to all accounting tasks, explaining each fraudulent transaction in detail and showing how the systematic theft had been disguised as legitimate business expenses. Her presentation included charts and graphs that made the pattern of fraud visually obvious, even to board members without extensive financial backgrounds. The total amount of diverted funds exceeds $320,000, Linda reported, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was revealing. Additionally, we've identified approximately $80,000 in unauthorized salary and benefit payments to family members, for positions that serve no legitimate business function, or for work that was never actually performed. The financial impact was staggering. But Linda's presentation also revealed how Rebecca's theft had created cascading problems throughout Martinez Construction's operations. Money that should have been available for equipment maintenance had been diverted to personal accounts, resulting in machinery breakdowns that delayed projects and frustrated clients. Funds earmarked for supplier payments had been redirected to support the luxury lifestyle that Rebecca's family had been enjoying, creating cash flow problems that threatened the company's ability to complete existing contracts. Tyler had prepared a timeline that correlated Rebecca's fraudulent activities with specific operational problems that had affected Martinez Construction's performance and reputation. His analysis showed how each major theft had coincided with missed deadlines, supplier disputes, or client complaints that could be traced directly to the lack of funds that Rebecca's criminal activity had created. The pattern is clear, Tyler explained with the same analytical precision he'd learned from working alongside Dad and the company's project managers. Every time Aunt Rebecca authorized large personal expenditures or payments to fictitious vendors, our operational budgets came up short, and projects experienced problems that damaged our relationships with clients and subcontractors. Rebecca finally found her voice, but her response revealed desperation rather than any legitimate defense of her actions. "This is ridiculous," she protested, her voice rising with the kind of artificial indignation that people display when they've been caught in wrongdoing they can't deny. "Every expenditure I authorized served legitimate business purposes, and if there are questions about documentation, they can be explained through normal business discussions." James Hartwell responded by presenting specific examples of Rebecca's fraudulent activities, including payments to companies that existed only as post office boxes, expense reports for business trips that had actually been personal vacations, and salary payments for work that company records showed had never been performed. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, supported by bank records, correspondence, and testimony from suppliers and subcontractors who'd been affected by Rebecca's theft. "Mrs. Martinez-Stone," James continued, "we have documentation showing that you created shell companies for the sole purpose of receiving fraudulent payments from Martinez Construction. We have evidence that you've been systematically inflating expense reports and authorizing payments for goods and services that were never delivered to the company. This isn't a matter of questionable business judgment. These are criminal acts that have put the company's survival at risk." The presentation continued with evidence that Dad had been collecting before his death, including correspondence with Linda Chen about suspicious transactions and his own investigation into vendors and expenses that didn't match his project records. The comprehensive nature of his documentation revealed that Robert Martinez had been building a criminal case against his own daughter, a responsibility that had clearly caused him tremendous personal anguish, while remaining absolutely necessary to protect the company and its employees. Mom sat quietly throughout the presentation, tears streaming down her face as she processed the full extent of Rebecca's betrayal of everything Dad had worked to build. Margaret Martinez had spent 6 months believing that her older daughter was competently managing the family business, only to discover that Rebecca had actually been systematically looting the company while allowing its operations and reputation to deteriorate. "Rebecca," Mom said finally, her voice breaking with the pain of someone forced to confront the criminal behavior of her own child, "how could you steal from your father's company? How could you take money that belonged to your sister's family and the employees who depend on us for their livelihoods?" Rebecca's response revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement, and her complete lack of understanding about the impact of her criminal activities on other people's lives. "I wasn't stealing," she insisted, her voice taking on the whining tone she'd used since childhood to avoid responsibility for her actions. "I was investing in the company's future and managing resources more efficiently than Daddy ever did. If there are accounting irregularities, they're the result of Linda's incompetence, not any wrongdoing on my part." The accusation against Linda Chen was so obviously false and so deeply unfair that it galvanized the entire room against Rebecca's increasingly desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Linda had been scrupulously honest and professionally competent throughout 8 years of service to Martinez Construction, and her discovery of Rebecca's fraud had been the result of exactly the kind of careful attention to detail that had made her such a valuable employee. Marcus Johnson spoke for the first time during the meeting, his voice reflecting the moral authority that came from 20 years of honest work and loyalty to the Martinez family. "Rebecca, I've been working construction for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone damage a company's reputation as quickly as you've damaged ours. Suppliers won't extend credit, subcontractors demand immediate payment, and clients are starting to question whether we can complete projects on schedule. Your father built this company on trust and integrity, and you've destroyed both in less than a year." The condemnation from Marcus carried special weight because of his intimate knowledge of Martinez Construction's operations and his personal relationship with Dad, stretching back to the company's early years. His willingness to speak against Rebecca publicly demonstrated that the damage she'd caused extended far beyond financial theft to include destruction of the collaborative relationships that had made the company successful. James Hartwell concluded the evidence presentation by explaining the legal consequences that Rebecca would face as a result of her criminal activities. The charges would include embezzlement, fraud, money laundering through fictitious companies, and breach of fiduciary duty as a company officer. The potential penalties included significant imprisonment, substantial financial restitution, and permanent prohibition from serving in any management capacity for Martinez Construction or any other business. Additionally, James continued, the evidence of fraud provides legal grounds for voiding Mrs. Martinez Stone's ownership interests in the company and transferring those interests to family members who can demonstrate genuine commitment to the business and its values. Mr. Martinez's revised estate planning documents, while never formally executed due to his untimely death, provide clear evidence of his intentions for company succession based on demonstrated competence rather than family relationships alone. The revelation that Rebecca could lose not just her management position but also her ownership stake in Martinez Construction seemed to finally break through her defensive denial about the seriousness of the situation she'd created. The prospect of losing everything while facing criminal prosecution forced her to confront the reality that her fraudulent activities had consequences that extended far beyond the temporary embarrassment she'd apparently expected to face. Connor looked devastated as he began to understand that his mother's criminal behavior would affect his own future prospects and the lifestyle that his family had been enjoying at Martinez Construction's expense. At 18, he was old enough to face potential legal consequences if investigators determined that he'd knowingly benefited from stolen money, though James had indicated that prosecutors typically focused on the primary perpetrators rather than family members who might have been unaware of the criminal activity. The board voted unanimously to remove Rebecca from all management positions immediately, to cooperate fully with law enforcement investigation of her criminal activities, and to pursue civil litigation to recover stolen funds and restructure the company's ownership according to Dad's documented intentions. The decision was legally and morally necessary, but it also marked the end of any possibility for family reconciliation or healing of the relationships that Rebecca's actions had destroyed. Tyler and Lily had remained quiet throughout the formal proceedings, but their presence represented the future that Dad had been trying to protect through his careful documentation of Rebecca's crimes. At 17 and 15, they'd already demonstrated more genuine understanding of Martinez Construction's values and operations than Rebecca had shown during her entire tenure as a company officer. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca made one final attempt to avoid accountability by threatening legal action against the rest of the family for what she characterized as a conspiracy to deprive her of her rightful inheritance. The threat was both legally baseless and morally offensive, revealing that she still didn't understand the gravity of her criminal behavior or the extent to which her actions had damaged the company and betrayed the trust that Dad had placed in her. "Rebecca," I said quietly, speaking directly to my sister for what I knew would probably be the last time, "Dad spent months documenting your theft because he loved this company and the people who depend on it for their livelihoods. He died trying to protect what he'd built, and we're going to finish what he started. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." The immediate aftermath of the board meeting brought a mixture of relief and sadness as we began the process of reporting Rebecca's crimes to law enforcement and implementing the changes necessary to restore Martinez Construction's financial stability and operational effectiveness. James Hartwell filed the initial criminal complaint that afternoon, while Linda Chen began working with forensic accountants to trace stolen funds and identify assets that could be recovered through civil litigation. Within 48 hours, Rebecca and Connor had vacated their positions at Martinez Construction, leaving behind company property and access credentials that were immediately secured to prevent any further unauthorized activities. Madison's social media position was eliminated as part of cost-cutting measures that would help the company recover from the financial damage that Rebecca's theft had caused. The investigation expanded rapidly as law enforcement agencies recognized the sophistication of Rebecca's fraud scheme and the substantial amount of money involved in her criminal activities. Federal charges were filed within a week, and Rebecca's assets were frozen, pending resolution of both criminal and civil proceedings that would determine restitution for the money she'd stolen. Marcus Johnson stepped into an expanded role as operations manager, bringing his decades of construction experience to bear on the challenge of rebuilding client relationships and restoring Martinez Construction's reputation in the industry. His leadership helped stabilize the company's day-to-day operations, while legal proceedings worked their way through the court system. Tyler's role in uncovering the fraud and his demonstrated competence in understanding complex business operations led to his appointment as Junior Project Coordinator, a position that recognized his contributions while providing structured learning opportunities as he prepared for college and eventual succession in company leadership. 6 months after the board meeting that had exposed Rebecca's crimes, Martinez Construction was operating profitably again, with restored relationships among suppliers and subcontractors who'd been affected by the cash flow problems her theft had created. The company's reputation for integrity and competence had been damaged but not destroyed, and the transparent way we'd addressed the fraud had actually enhanced our credibility with clients who valued honest dealing above all other considerations. Rebecca was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of the money she'd stolen, a judgment that would likely take decades to satisfy completely. Connor and Madison faced the difficult adjustment of living without the unearned advantages that their mother's criminal activities had provided, but they were gradually learning the value of honest work and personal responsibility that had always been central to the Martinez family's values. Looking back on the crisis that had threatened to destroy everything Dad had built, I realized that his careful preparation and documentation had made the difference between losing the company entirely and being able to save it for future generations. The safe behind his desk had contained more than just evidence of fraud. It had held his final gift to his family in the form of tools and information that allowed us to protect his legacy when he was no longer able to do so himself. Tyler and Lily had learned lessons about integrity, responsibility, and family loyalty that would serve them well as they prepared to take leadership roles in Martinez Construction's future. They'd seen firsthand how criminal behavior destroys relationships and damages everyone connected to it, but they'd also seen how honest work and careful preparation can overcome even the most serious challenges. The Grand Magnolia Hotel story had ended with cleaning duties becoming the foundation for future success. But our story at Martinez Construction had shown that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, but rather the values and preparation that allow honest people to protect what matters most when crisis threatens everything they hold dear. Dad's safe had contained the tools we needed to save his company, but more importantly, it had demonstrated his continued protection of the family he'd loved enough to spend his final months building a case against his own daughter to preserve the legacy he'd worked his entire life to create. The shocking discovery had been painful beyond description, But it had also been the key to ensuring that Martinez Construction would survive to serve future generations of the family that had built it through honest work and unwavering integrity. The federal courthouse in downtown Riverside buzzed with activity on the morning of Rebecca's sentencing hearing, 18 months after the board meeting that had exposed her systematic theft from Martinez Construction. I sat in the gallery with Tyler and Lily, watching as my sister was led into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to symbolize how far she'd fallen from the designer suits and executive privileges she'd once considered her birthright. The weight of evidence that Dad had carefully assembled, combined with the additional documentation that federal investigators had uncovered, had made her conviction inevitable, despite her attorney's attempts to minimize her culpability. Judge Patricia Coleman had presided over white-collar crime cases for 15 years, and her reputation for thorough analysis and fair sentencing had made her respected throughout the legal community. She'd spent weeks reviewing the extensive documentation of Rebecca's fraudulent activities, including the forensic accounting reports that revealed the sophisticated nature of her embezzlement scheme and the substantial impact it had on Martinez Construction's operations and employees. Mrs. Martinez-Stone, Judge Coleman began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen countless cases of financial fraud but never became immune to the human cost of such crimes. You held a position of trust in a family business that employed 50 people and served your community for 25 years. Your systematic theft of over $400,000 wasn't just a crime against your family. It was a betrayal of every employee who depended on the company for their livelihood, and every client who trusted Martinez Construction to complete their projects honestly and professionally. The final amount of stolen money had increased as federal investigators uncovered additional layers of Rebecca's fraud, including sophisticated schemes involving fake subcontractor payments and inflated material costs that had been designed to hide the theft over an extended period. Her creation of shell companies to facilitate the embezzlement had demonstrated a level of premeditation that impressed even experienced financial crimes prosecutors who'd seen similar cases throughout their careers. Tyler squeezed my hand as Judge Coleman continued her remarks, his maturity at 18 reflecting the lessons he'd learned from watching how criminal behavior destroys families and damages communities. He'd spent the past year and a half working full-time at Martinez Construction while attending community college classes in business management, preparing himself for the leadership responsibilities that would eventually fall to him as Dad's legacy continued through another generation. The evidence presented in this case reveals that your criminal activities began shortly after your father's business began experiencing the kind of success that attracts attention from competitors and creates opportunities for expansion, Judge Coleman observed, referencing the timeline that prosecutors had established, showing how Rebecca's theft had accelerated as Martinez Construction's reputation and profitability had grown. Rather than contributing to that success through honest work, you chose to exploit your family relationships and abuse the trust that had been placed in you. Lily had remained remarkably composed throughout the lengthy legal proceedings, but I could see tears in her eyes as she listened to the judge's description of how Rebecca's actions had affected not just our immediate family, but the broader community of employees, suppliers, and clients who'd been damaged by her fraudulent activities. At 16, Lily had already demonstrated more understanding of business ethics and personal responsibility than Rebecca had shown during her entire adult life. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation reflected the severity of Rebecca's crimes and the need to send a clear message about the consequences of embezzling from family businesses. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres had built his career prosecuting financial fraud cases, and his presentation of evidence against Rebecca had been both comprehensive and devastating in its revelation of her systematic criminal behavior. Your Honor, Torres addressed the court, the defendant's crimes weren't impulsive acts of desperation but rather calculated theft that continued over nearly 2 years, despite multiple opportunities to stop and make restitution. She created elaborate schemes to hide her criminal activity, attempted to blame innocent employees when questioned about irregularities, and showed no remorse for the damage her actions caused to her family's business and their employees' livelihoods. Rebecca's defense attorney had argued for leniency based on her lack of prior criminal history and the emotional trauma of losing her father, but those arguments had been undermined by evidence showing the premeditated nature of her fraud and her continued attempts to avoid responsibility even after being confronted. Her refusal to accept a plea bargain that would have resulted in a lighter sentence had demonstrated either misguided confidence in her ability to avoid conviction or complete failure to understand the strength of the evidence against her. The victim impact statements had been particularly powerful in demonstrating the real-world consequences of Rebecca's criminal behavior. Marcus Johnson had testified about the damage to Martinez Construction's reputation and the stress experienced by longtime employees who'd watched the company struggle with cash flow problems, while not understanding that theft was the underlying cause of those difficulties. Judge Coleman, Marcus had said during his testimony, "I worked for Robert Martinez for 20 years, and I never saw him treat anyone unfairly or make a business decision that put his own interests ahead of his employees' welfare. His daughter took money that should have gone to worker paychecks and equipment maintenance, and she did it while pretending to care about the company's success. That kind of betrayal affects everyone who depends on honest business practices to make a living." Ana Rodriguez had also provided testimony about the hostile work environment that Rebecca had created through her attempts to intimidate employees who asked legitimate questions about financial irregularities. Her description of Rebecca's verbal attacks and threats had revealed a pattern of abusive behavior that extended beyond financial crimes to include workplace harassment and attempts to silence potential witnesses to her criminal activities. Mrs. Martinez Stone created an atmosphere of fear and confusion, Ana had testified, her voice shaking as she recalled the stress of working under Rebecca's management. She attacked anyone who questioned her decisions, threatened people's jobs if they didn't follow her orders without discussion, and made it clear that she considered herself above the professional standards that Mr. Martinez had established for company operations. The financial impact assessment had been staggering in its comprehensiveness, revealing not just the direct cost of Rebecca's theft, but also the indirect damages caused by her mismanagement and the long-term effects on Martinez Construction's competitive position in the regional construction market. The total economic harm exceeded $1 million when all factors were considered, including lost contracts, damaged supplier relationships, and the cost of legal proceedings necessary to recover stolen funds. Linda Chen had provided expert testimony about the sophisticated accounting manipulation that Rebecca had used to hide her theft, explaining how she'd exploited legitimate business processes to create false documentation for fraudulent transactions. Her analysis had revealed a level of financial sophistication that contradicted Rebecca's attempts to portray herself as someone who'd made innocent mistakes rather than deliberate criminal choices. The defendant understood exactly what she was doing. Linda had testified with the precision that had made her such a valuable employee throughout 8 years of service to Martinez Construction. She created detailed documentation to support false expense claims, established relationships with fictitious vendors to facilitate money laundering, and systematically manipulated accounting records to hide the theft. These weren't accidents or oversights. They were carefully planned criminal activities that required extensive knowledge of business operations and financial systems. Judge Coleman had clearly been influenced by the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the impact testimony from people whose lives had been damaged by Rebecca's criminal behavior. Her sentencing remarks reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the need to provide appropriate consequences for someone who'd betrayed family trust while damaging an entire community of employees and business partners. Mrs. Martinez Stone, the court sentences you to 4 years and 6 months in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised probation, Judge Coleman announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that this sentence would affect multiple generations of the Martinez family. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $423,000, representing the full value of funds you stole from Martinez Construction, plus interest and administrative costs. The sentence was slightly longer than the prosecution had requested, reflecting Judge Coleman's assessment that Rebecca's lack of remorse and continued attempts to blame others for her criminal behavior warranted additional punishment beyond the standard guidelines for financial fraud cases. The restitution order would likely take decades to satisfy completely, ensuring that Rebecca would face ongoing financial consequences for her crimes long after her release from prison. Connor sat in the gallery behind his mother, his face showing the emotional toll of watching his family's complete collapse over the past 18 months. At 19, he'd been forced to confront the reality that his comfortable lifestyle had been built on stolen money, and that his future prospects would be shaped by his mother's criminal reputation. rather than the advantages he'd once expected to inherit through family connections. The transformation in Connor's character had been remarkable to witness, as the entitled teenager who'd once treated Martinez Construction as his personal playground had gradually developed genuine respect for honest work and appreciation for the employees who'd always treated him with kindness, despite his privileged position. His part-time job at a local hardware store had taught him lessons about earning respect through competence, rather than expecting it through family relationships. Madison had chosen not to attend the sentencing hearing, but I'd heard from mutual acquaintances that she'd been working as a server at a restaurant while attending classes at Riverside Community College. Her adjustment to life without the luxurious lifestyle that Rebecca's theft had supported had been difficult, but it had also provided opportunities for personal growth that might not have occurred if she'd continued to benefit from unearned advantages. As we left the courthouse that morning, Tyler and Lily walked beside me with the quiet dignity that had characterized their behavior throughout the long legal process that had dominated our lives for over a year. They'd never expressed satisfaction at seeing their aunt sentenced to prison, but they'd also never wavered in their support for holding her accountable for crimes that had threatened to destroy everything their grandfather had worked to build. The drive back to Martinez Construction took us through neighborhoods where Dad had completed dozens of projects over the years, tangible reminders of the positive impact that honest business practices could have on entire communities. Houses, office buildings, and retail centers bore the subtle Martinez Construction signs that had become symbols of quality workmanship and reliable service throughout the Riverside area. "Mom," Lily said as we passed a shopping center that Dad had helped renovate 5 years earlier, "do you think Grandpa would be proud of how we handled everything? I know he would have hated seeing Aunt Rebecca go to prison, but he also would have wanted to protect the company and all the people who work for us." The question reflected the moral complexity that had characterized every decision we'd made since discovering Dad's hidden documentation of Rebecca's crimes. Robert Martinez had been a man who valued family relationships deeply, but he'd also been someone who understood that protecting innocent people sometimes required difficult choices that caused pain to those we loved. "I think Grandpa would be proud that we chose to do what was right even when it was hard," I replied, remembering the countless conversations I'd had with Dad about the importance of maintaining integrity even when it created personal or professional challenges. He spent his whole life showing us that building something worthwhile requires making tough decisions and standing up for your principles, especially when it costs you something important. Tyler nodded thoughtfully, his expression showing the wisdom that came from watching how criminal behavior affects entire families and communities. Grandpa's documentation saved the company, but more than that, it showed us what kind of people we want to be. Aunt Rebecca thought she could take shortcuts and avoid consequences, but Grandpa proved that honest work and careful preparation are the only things that really last. The conversation reminded me of one of Dad's favorite sayings about construction work. "You can't build anything solid on a foundation that isn't strong enough to support the weight of what you're trying to create." Rebecca had tried to build a lifestyle on the unstable foundation of stolen money and fraudulent business practices, and the inevitable collapse had destroyed not just her own future but had damaged relationships and opportunities that might have lasted for. Martinez Construction's recovery had been steady but challenging, requiring careful attention to rebuilding relationships with suppliers and clients who'd been affected by the cash flow problems that Rebecca's theft had created. The transparency we'd maintained throughout the legal proceedings had actually enhanced our reputation for integrity, as business partners recognized that we'd been willing to sacrifice family relationships to address criminal behavior honestly and completely. Marcus Johnson had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, a position that recognized both his technical expertise and his loyalty to the values that Dad had established for company culture. His leadership had been instrumental in maintaining project quality and employee morale during the difficult transition period that followed Rebecca's removal from management positions. "Sarah," Marcus said as we gathered in the conference room for our weekly management meeting, "I've been thinking about how your father would view where we are now compared to where we were 2 years ago. We're smaller than we were when Rebecca was inflating our numbers with fraudulent contracts, but we're also more profitable and more respected in the industry." The observation captured something important about the difference between sustainable growth based on honest business practices and artificial expansion funded through criminal activity. Martinez Construction's current operations reflected the solid foundation that Dad had built through 25 years of careful attention to quality workmanship and ethical business relationships. Linda Chen had also been promoted, taking on expanded responsibilities for financial planning and risk management that reflected both her technical competence and her courage in exposing Rebecca's fraudulent activities despite personal and professional risks. Her willingness to maintain professional standards under pressure had saved Martinez Construction from even greater financial damage and had provided the documentation necessary for successful criminal prosecution. The company's financial position is stronger now than it's been in 3 years, Linda reported during our quarterly review meeting. We've eliminated the artificial expenses that were draining cash flow, restructured our debt obligations to reflect realistic revenue projections, and established reserve funds that will protect us from future economic challenges. Tyler had enrolled in a formal apprenticeship program that combined his practical experience at Martinez Construction with structured education in construction management and business operations. His plan was to complete his associate degree while working full-time, then transfer to a 4-year university for advanced study in civil engineering and business administration. I want to understand every aspect of the business the way Grandpa did, Tyler explained when discussing his educational plans. He knew how to read blueprints, estimate materials, manage crews, handle finances, and maintain client relationships. That kind of comprehensive knowledge is what made him successful, and it's what I'll need to lead the company effectively when it's my turn. Lily had similarly committed herself to learning all aspects of Martinez Construction's operations, but her interests leaned more toward the financial and administrative side of the business. Her natural aptitude for organization and attention to detail had made her invaluable in helping restructure company procedures and documentation systems after Rebecca's fraudulent activities had created confusion and inefficiency. I want to make sure that what happened with Aunt Rebecca can never happen again, Lily said during a family discussion about her future role in the company. We need better internal controls, more transparent reporting systems, and clearer procedures for detecting and preventing financial irregularities. Grandpa's documentation saved us this time, but we should have systems in place that would catch problems before they become crises. The lessons we'd learned from Rebecca's crimes had influenced every aspect of how we approached business operations and family relationships. The experience had been painful beyond description, but it had also taught us valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining professional standards even within family businesses, and the need for transparent communication about problems before they become unmanageable. Mom had found her own role in Martinez Construction's recovery, using her social connections and community relationships to help rebuild the company's reputation and expand our network of potential clients and business partners. Her transformation from grieving widow to active business participant had been gradual but meaningful, providing her with purpose and connection that helped her process Dad's death and move forward with hope for the future. Your father always said that the construction business was really about building relationships, Mom observed during one of our planning meetings. The buildings and projects are important, but the connections with clients, suppliers, and employees are what make a company successful over the long term. Rebecca forgot that lesson, and it's why her approach to business was ultimately destructive. The community response to how we'd handled Rebecca's crimes had been overwhelmingly positive, with other business owners expressing respect for our willingness to address family criminal behavior transparently and completely. Several potential clients had specifically mentioned that they'd chosen Martinez Construction for projects because they valued working with a company that demonstrated integrity even when it required personal sacrifice. 3 years after Dad's death and 2 years after Rebecca's conviction, Martinez Construction had achieved a level of stability and respect that exceeded even the success we'd enjoyed during Dad's lifetime. The company employed 62 people, had expanded into commercial renovation projects that utilized our expertise in historical preservation, and had established a reputation for innovation in sustainable construction practices that Tyler's environmental interests had helped develop. The annual company picnic that summer felt like a celebration of everything Dad had hoped to achieve when he'd started Martinez Construction, from nothing but determination and honest work ethic. Employees brought their families, suppliers and subcontractors joined the festivities, and several major clients attended to show their appreciation for the quality of work and professional relationships that had made our projects successful. Dad would have loved this, I said to Tyler and Lily as we watched Marcus Johnson's grandchildren playing games with the children of newer employees who'd joined the company during our expansion phase. He always said that a successful business should feel like an extended family, with everyone working together toward shared goals and supporting each other through challenges. Tyler and Lily had both grown into the kind of young adults that Dad would have been proud to see carrying forward his legacy. They understood that privilege came with responsibility, that success required both hard work and ethical behavior, and that building something worthwhile meant making decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term advantages. The safe behind Dad's desk had remained empty since we'd removed all of his documentation about Rebecca's crimes, but we decided to keep it as a reminder of his foresight and his commitment to protecting our family's future, even after his death. Sometimes, the most important inheritance isn't money or property, but rather the values and principles that guide people through difficult decisions when everything they care about is at risk. Rebecca's crimes had threatened to destroy everything Dad had built, but his careful preparation and documentation had given us the tools we needed to save Martinez Construction and preserve the values that had made it successful. The shocking discovery in his office had revealed the full extent of her betrayal, but it had also demonstrated his continued protection of the family and business he'd devoted his life to creating and maintaining. Looking back on everything that had happened since that Saturday morning when we'd first opened Dad's safe, I realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about financial fraud or family betrayal, but rather about the enduring power of honest work and careful preparation to overcome even the most serious challenges. Dad's legacy lived on not just in the company that bore his name, but in the values and principles that continued to guide every decision we made about its future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.